Great. Thank you very much, Katja, for the introduction. Yeah, recording started as well. Okay, then welcome, my dear friends of SAP Security, and hello everyone to this webinar as part of our SAP Security Weeks series. I'm Carsten, working as a SAP Security consultant and SAP trainer in Exciting in a German subsidiary, and my main topic is, as already mentioned, secure authentication and single sign-on in a hybrid SAP world. Yeah, this presentation aims to provide you with a lot of recommendations, best practices, and also answers to frequently asked questions that we encounter in our projects, all related, of course, to authentication and identity lifecycle based on the SAP Cloud Identity Services. So the target audience for this session are rather IT and solution architects, administrators, IDM consultants, and also decision makers. However, SAP Basis guys are also warmly welcome here as well. So then let's take a look at the agenda. First of all, our primary focus will be on fundamental concepts. And in this presentation, we have prepared, let's say, the most important scenarios. Given the time constraints of 1 hour, it is next to impossible to really cover all potential use cases that you can, let's say, establish with the cloud identity services. So first, we will start discussing some basics and then provide you an overview of the SAP Cloud Identity Services main components and how they can help you to manage authentication and also user identities. And we will also cover some typical authentication and single sign-on pattern, like operating the identity authentication service in the proxy mode, using identity federation settings, the importance of persisting users in the identity directory. And also we discuss some IPS-related things like real-world ID lifecycle scenarios, including the integration with IDM systems. And finally, we will conclude with key takeaways that contains a lot of SAP recommendations along with helpful links to documents and blogs and some of our services that really will help you to deepen the knowledge that is shared in this overview presentation. All right, with that being said, let's take a look shortly at Exciting. Let me briefly introduce you Exciting. Guess you have already seen those slides, so I got just one. So Exciting has been around since 2008. We were founded and still headquartered in Switzerland with offices throughout Europe, in Germany, in Switzerland, in UK, in Romania, and also in the United States. So obviously, Exciting specializes in SAP security. So we provide services in form of consulting and helping customers with role designs. When it comes to S/4HANA migrations, we implement GRC and identity access governance, identity management from SAP single sign-on. We implement security monitoring and also some other SAP security related tasks. We also provide expert tools as part of our portfolio, and we are an SAP education partner. So we do a lot of space in the trainings, let's say SAP trainings together with customers and also with SAP. And as of today, we are around 120 employees. Teams are still growing globally. Yeah, that should be it for the short introduction. And today's topic, as I said, is identity lifecycle and secure authentication with the SAP Cloud Identity Services. So let's get started. As a consultant, I often commence my presentation by introducing the next few slides to tell a short story of what has been changed in the cloud world. And as depicted here, it's obvious that the SAP Cloud is not the only player in the field. So enterprises are utilizing Microsoft Azure AD, for example, very heavily. They use Office 365. They use many other software as a service applications. So it's quite normal to face multiple cloud landscapes. And that really points out also the importance of integration and also standardization when it comes to IAM, to identity and access management. So many customers extended their Active Directory in the cloud using Azure AD. So this use case normally means that data is replicated from the on-premises Active Directory to the Azure AD tenant in the cloud, which then serves as a primary user repository. And this is a common use case because customers connect multiple applications to their Azure platform, which provides many services, which operates as a hyperscaler as well. So replicating persisting user data in Azure AD is essential for efficient and secure identity management in this environment. Now, on the other hand, we can see we have this SAP bubble here, the SAP Business Technology Platform, which brings its own set of security capabilities and also foundational platform services. It includes also the SAP Cloud Identity Services. And like in the Active Directory and Azure scenario, many of SAP's BTP and software as a service applications require user persistence and also special attributes to uniquely identify users in the ecosystem. So the SAP Cloud Identity Services aim to address those requirements. They seem to provide a seamless authentication experience and also a way to automate the identity lifecycle and also user onboarding in the hybrid landscape. And also, of course, the integration with Azure AD and other services is possible as well. It's just to point out there's an on-premise world. Still, of course, it's always a hybrid world. There's the SAP Cloud, but it's not only the only cloud we have to consider, especially when it comes to identity and access management. As we talk about cloud security services, I often also show up this one. This slide contains some buzzwords. It compares the on-premise with the cloud world. And in the SAP on-premises landscape on the left side, you know, the SAP Basis team typically have a good knowledge about the current system architecture, the standards used, the technology behind. On the SAP Cloud side, the topic looks quite different, especially, you know, when it comes to authentication and authorization. So here, the procedures, the technologies used are quite different. Now we're dealing with OAuth, with JOT, with SAML, with OpenID Connect and that kind of stuff. And also the provisioning of users is typically here done using the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, SCIM protocol. So there are many new standards, APIs, processes, development tools, and organizations are faced with those new requirements. And that means they have to rethink a little bit. It's no longer just the on-premise world. So previously, SAP was known for using proprietary interfaces and also protocols, and this has really changed. So SAP's approach now is centered on standards, which is really a good thing, you know, because it offers benefits in terms of to ensure a interoperability. But on the other hand, it poses a challenge in terms of the various ways in which companies can manage identities or manage authentication in such a hybrid world. And when it comes to those topics, processes for example, user creation, are highly customer specific. So we have some organizations that manually maintain their few users they may have, and others want to heavily rely on their Active Directory as a source system. Others integrate with the success factors or any kind of other third-party HCM, or even use an identity management. So aim is always to integrate with the whole landscape if it is possible. And that's why it's crucial to understand the flexibility that those underlying technologies that we see here already provide, like SAML, like a SCIM protocol. That's really the foundation for those topics related to the identity and access management. And when it comes to IAM, ultimately you first have to consider the different personas that will use your application. So the individual security requirement that may arise from those different user types. So in modern IT, authentication is no longer just about logging in with a central password and that's it. So it's really about detecting when a user is connecting, for example, from a managed device or from a known IP range, and using this, I call it context information, to really influence the authentication behavior. So this ensures a seamless single sign-on for those, let's say, managed users and devices. However, when a user may access the same application from an unknown device, such as in a Starbucks scenario, for example, a higher level of authentication and also identity verification may be necessary. So that can include a risk-based, a multi-factor authentication, or even the use of some FIDO2 compatible hardware devices and biometrics. And when it comes to authentication flows and identity lifecycle, clear its automation should be the target. So in such a world with multiple applications, it's no longer a good idea to manage users manually. And lastly, on the step 4, we can see that there's an access governance related to authorizations. So you need to manage and prevent access risks because its employees' functions may change or the roles may change, and this may lead to conflicts that are really hard to detect without a GRC tool. So SAP Identity Access Governance, for example, in combination with access control, ensure that risks that result from newly assigned authorizations can be mitigated accordingly. That's on top of IAM, to be honest. That's not part of the SAP Cloud Identity Services. However, to see it as a big picture in this case. All right, that's it for the introduction part. Now let's finally talk about the SAP Cloud Identity Services. So, yeah, as the name says, obviously it's a cloud service from SAP that's related to the topic of identity and access management and is designed to manage user identities and also access across the many SAP applications and services in the SAP Cloud. So it allows users, your enterprise or corporate users, to seamlessly access their many applications and data from almost anywhere on any device. And it enables, on the other hand, administrators to manage user access and authentication in a central way. So as you can imagine, since more and more software as a service applications are being onboarded, it's getting harder to create all these trust relationships, these SAML trusts, to create the user accounts, or to even manage the life cycle of those, or to manually log in using passwords for each application. So it's mainly the increased usage of the many SAP Cloud products that brought the need for those services. So the primary purpose is to provide organizations with a secure, with a unified way, you could say, as in a single platform to manage user identities, to manage authentication and access controls. It will be a future topic of this solution, and also to serve as an integration point with an existing, probably existing IDM solution. So in general, the cloud identity services are still public cloud service operated by SAP, available in many regions and data centers around the world. And also it's to be considered as a core service running on and also deeply integrated with the BTP, the Business Technology Platform. So they are delivered with one and also a test, one productive and also test tenant per customer. So when you have multiple SAP Cloud products, like the one we can see here on the right side, they all should be integrated with the same identity services tenant. So best practice is really to attach your productive SAP Cloud Identity Services tenant to all systems while operating a second one for such systems like sandboxes, integration test systems, and that stuff. Of course, it's possible to get more of those tenants. You can license additional ones through the SAP store. And Cloud Identity Services supports most of the common industry standards, and this way allows very flexible deployment scenarios and also integration scenarios. So in our work with SAP customers, we see very diverse requirements and needs. So some just need to solve some basic authentication capabilities, like to ensure a single sign-on for their few SAP Cloud applications in use. So they mainly have the scope on the identity authentication service that we see here on the screen. They have no touch points with user provisioning at all. And on the other hand, it depends on the number of cloud solutions, so requirements for harmonized user data, like master data governance tools, identity lifecycle requirements, or maybe what legal or compliance requirements must be taken into consideration. So it's depending really on the organization, on the topic, on the size of the organization. And the larger the company, mostly the large companies are interested in integrating with their own IDM solutions. So it's important to note that there is no one size fits all solution. There are plenty of scenarios possible. It's just as in the on-premise world, where some organizations don't use IDM or even a central user administration, while others already automate their user management, often with custom solutions. So in summary, you can see here on the screen the identity authentication, or IAS. You can see the identity provisioning, or IPS, and in the middle, the identity directory, which is shared between those two components. So all is based on the same technology stack as of now, and is considered and also pre-delivered with SAP's software as a service solution. So whenever you have a global account in the BTP, or you purchase some of those SaaS solutions that you can see here on the screen, you will be able to use those services free of charge. So let's take a deeper look on each of these components now. And the first step, we have the Identity Authentication Service, the IAS, which is considered as the main identity provider in the cloud, responsible for all SAP applications and to consolidate the whole trust management. So the aim of this approach is really to standardize the onboarding of additional SAP cloud applications. So as of today, many companies usually have an existing identity provider, and the Identity Authentication Service can be easily connected there. We will talk about that in a while and answer some common questions concerning these topics, because it's often asked and many customers have no idea and understanding why the IAS is now available and needs to be used. Next one is the Identity Directory, or also called Identity Directory Service. So shown here in the middle, it is seen as a central user database, which is shared from Identity Authentication Service and Identity Provisioning Service. So if you are familiar with the IAS, and maybe already have created some users and groups there, you should know that the data that is sourced directly from the Identity Directory. So objects that you create there are stored in the Identity Directory. Think of it as a central user store that consolidates all identities in one place. It's like a central user administration, but for the cloud. So it creates an SAP user identity that is used to access the entire SAP Cloud application ecosystem. And also storing user information centrally in this identity directory simplifies the process of ensuring a proper user lifecycle. And it's also the foundation whenever you want to integrate with many BTP services, like, for example, identity and access governance, or the SAP Task Center. So there are some success factor scenarios. You need to use user persistence, and you need to have your users in the identity directory. So bottom line, SAP recommends persisting users there, and it's a key for centralized user management. And also it ensures the proper integration with an IDM solution. So in general, it also owns crucial attributes. It creates those, like, for example, the SAP Global User ID, formerly known as UUID. And it also can be enriched with further attributes, like, for example, a per person user ID or some other attributes that may come from a success factor solution. So it's not only a database that is used inside of the Identity Authentication Service, but also you can access it using a SCIM API. So objects in this identity directory, like users, like groups, like schemas, can be programmatically accessed, modified, and you can even have up to 20 custom schemas with a maximum of up to 400 custom attributes that you can maintain there in addition to the normal user attributes. So it's a really important component, and you should not you should even anyhow consider it whenever it comes to identity lifecycle. Maybe not so very important when it comes only to authentication using the IIS, but as soon as you think about how to manage user lifecycle, how to automate onboarding and offboarding, then it really makes sense to persist users there. And the third component is the SAP Cloud Identity Provisioning Service, or in short, IPS. It is intended to really synchronize users from a given source system to various SAP target applications. And that may have their own user store. Those target applications where users normally have to be created manually or have to be imported using CSV files and that kind of stuff. So it allows to automate user lifecycle and aims to keep users in sync between different systems. However, please consider that it has no feature parity with an IDM solution. So it means it will not replace an IDM system. And in direct comparison, it also lacks many features. Yeah? For example, there are no business roles and there is no workflow engine and so on. So it's really a job-driven engine that allows you to transform, to modify. It comes with a lot of connectors, but it's more or less just a job-driven tool. Yeah? And together with the IPS, SAP offers a lot of standard adapters, or call it connectors or whatever. So the most of their cloud applications are supported. The good thing is that the IPS also supplies a proxy function, and it takes over the communication between the SAP Cloud application and, for example, an identity management system. So, for example, systems that normally would not support SAP Cloud target applications will then be able to use the proxy mode, in this case, to support those applications. And we will talk about this in the integration scenarios later on. First of all, we will start now with some often used scenarios related to authentication and some common questions when it comes to implement the identity authentication service. So first IIS, and then we will focus on the IPS component. That's just a small summary for you, really to have some most important, let's say, information about the cloud identity services. As I said before, really consider it as one point to synchronize user information, to enable single sign-on, to maintain trust relationship, and also as one user provisioning endpoint. We don't need to talk about all this. I already mentioned it before. So let's jump over to, first of all, to authentication, typical authentication scenarios and frequently asked questions in this space. All right, so what we see here on the screen is a scenario that is currently in use by many SAP customers. So you have a BTP or software as a service, BTP SAP account, software as a service application, and you have directly connected it with your identity provider. Yeah? We call it in this context the corporate IDP, so the already existing one, like an ADFS, like an Azure Active Directory, like an Okta, or whatever kind of IDP it may be. So it's directly connected, and it's still possible today for many SAP applications. However, this approach, even if it worked for the last few years, it's no longer a recommendation, and it's considered as outdated. Yeah, that often leads to discussions in projects, and I will tell you why. So IIS is already seen in the SAP space as the primary and also mandatory IDP for many software as a service solutions. Let me just skip further here. You can see on the right upper side, on the right upper screen, a list of applications that are using IIS in a mandatory way. So talking about this often leads to discussions about the existing corporate authentication strategy, which is good, obviously, because authentication and also identity management should be a corporate responsibility and not part of the SAP basis team or any department within the SAP area. So as you can see here on the screen, every cloud application, every SAP cloud application typically represent a so-called service provider. So in many cases, the SAP ID service is pre-configured as a default IDP, which allows you to quickly log in with your SAPS user to do your initial setup and create users and assign rights and that stuff. But depending on the application, you may still be able to integrate it directly with your IDP. Like, for example, you can see here on the left side, SAP Analytics Cloud. Here it is still possible. In contrast, you can't do the same using SAP Integrated Business Planning. It's not possible. So this SAP Software as a Service application mandates to use the IAS as an identity provider. So it comes pre-integrated with it. Trust is already done. And the same is true for all the applications listed here. And the list is constantly growing. So since many SAP Cloud applications will be used maybe in the future, you should consider using the SAP Identity Authentication Service, the IAS, anyhow. However, you can easily connect it with your corporate IDP and delegate authentication to it. But that's one of the main use cases requiring you to rethink your current authentication strategy. In this structure, IAS acts as the main identity provider and provides a rule set that can be used to delegate authentication towards your existing IDP. And on your IDP, you still authenticate users based on your existing credentials and also security capabilities. We'll talk about this a little bit more detail in a minute. Okay. Next is not to forget the business technology platform. So to ensure authentication for business users, for your Cloud Foundry, multi-cloud environments, Neo environments, and that stuff, for the applications running there. So you can still set up trust between your sub-accounts and your corporate IDPs. But it is the better choice to use the automated trust management that is just one click away. So just choose your IAS tenant, click, and that's it. Trust is established. And in addition to this, let's say, to this user-based access, multi-factor authentication is a critical requirement for IT security, especially when it comes to administrative access. So the BTP now allows to use customers or allows customers to use their IAS tenant to log into the management tools, like, for example, the BTP cockpit, the command line interface, and also some Cloud Foundry clients. There are some restrictions. You can read it in the blog article and in the documentation here on the upper right side. However, it allows you to authenticate without using S users from SAP. And this feature has been already released in July last year. And it allows you to really have your own control of authentication, password policies, and user lifecycle. So setup process is really easy. You can do it for the whole global account. And yeah, and as I said before, more information you can find in the links embedded here in the presentation as well. So that's also a good reason why you should think about considering IAS as your main IDP and then just forward authentication to your corporate IDP. So that's again the picture about the identity authentication service. As I said before, it's quite often that you have all your SAP applications centralized. So trust management is centralized. You connect every application. And by the way, even SAP on-premises applications can be used and can be connected to the IAS free of charge. So you have, let's say, all these trusts established here. And on the other hand, you just federate one time with your corporate IDP, and that still have connected or still is connected with many other non-SAP service providers like it was before. And that works even without having any users in this system, the IAS. When it comes to, let's say, persisting users or creating not only employees, but also partner users, externals like customers and so on, then the identity directory comes into the game where you can create your users or maybe automatically provide your users in there. And then you can also make use of the authentication capabilities and security features that the Identity Authentication Service provides. There are a lot, so I don't talk about this in this webinar, so we have some other webinars that are focusing only on the single sign-on and stuff. Yeah, that's just a small overview here. So one of the key features in the IIS is really the proxy mode. In simple terms, proxy mode means IIS allows you to use your existing SAML IDP to authenticate users for all your SAP applications. And that SAP IIS acts as the middleman between the applications and the corporate IDP. So it allows users to log in without having to create new login credentials or even to have to create users at all in the Identity Authentication Service. So IIS handles the integration with the BTP from a federation and trust perspective, but it leaves the end user authentication in the hands of the corporate IDP. This means also that all non-SAP applications will still continue to use your existing IDP, but for your SAP applications, the SAML assertions are channeled through the IIS, and that gives you a higher level of flexibility. Yeah? So it's really important to mention, when functioning as a proxy, it's not necessary to have user profiles in the identity directory. Authentication flow, I think it's clear. User wants to access the application. It is connected to the IIS as the primary IDP, and it just forwards to your corporate IDP. And even here at this stage in the corporate IDP, you now have to authenticate for the first time. That means username, password, MFA, single sign-on. Now the first SAML assertion will be created from your corporate IDP, typically containing UPN or email address as a subject name identifier. And this is just forwarded to the IIS, and IIS will simply just take it, re-signs it, and forwards it to the application. Yeah? That's the proxy only scenario. And regarding this scenario, there are a lot of frequently asked questions. So we take a short look at the frequently asked questions now. So first of all, do users from our corporate IDP need to exist in the Identity Authentication User Store, or is it possible to use IIS as a pure proxy? I guess I already answered this. So yes, it's possible to use it as a pure proxy without having to create local users. And to be honest, it's a profile. It's not a user, because you don't need to create, even if you persist there, users there, you don't need to create credentials for your users. It's just a profile containing a lot of information about the users, attributes, not necessarily credentials. However, this is no longer a future-proof solution. It's not recommended because it's no longer supported by many new services like Task Center, like IHE, like in the BTP. A lot of new services require it. And also, whenever you want to consider identity lifecycle with the IPS, you should go, really take the step and persist your users. Next question: can we send different attribute as the subject name ID to the application, to the SAP applications, even if no user profile exists? For example, we send a username, even though the corporate IDP always sends the email. And also, yes, this is possible. You can change the subject name identifier. You can configure identity authentication just to forward a different attribute, a different assertion attribute that you may receive from your corporate IDP, like first name, last name, email, employee ID, whatever you can think of. Just manage that per application. You can then transform the name ID and send it via IIS to the application. Absolutely no problem, even though no user profiles exist. And there's a nice blog about explaining this in more detail. You should take a look here at this blog article. I can really recommend it. Next one: if we create the users in the identity directory, do they need passwords? Already answered, no, they don't require any password. They just need to authenticate against the corporate IDP, because still your corporate IDP should be the master, the one who really decides if the user is authenticated or not. Yeah? And I think that's clear. Next one, how does IIS determine if a user has a profile in IIS or not? And that's really easy. It's during the authentication process. Whenever you connect it as a proxy, so you have exchange of trust, the corporate IDP will send the first SAML response to the IIS. So usually it contains the user's email, the UPN, and this is used to verify the existence of the user's profile in the IIS user store. And if there is a user, you can make use of your local profile information, and you can have the knowledge about all these identifiers that you may require, like a SAP global user ID. If not, then you just have to stick with the assertion attributes that you get from your corporate IDP. Next one, what is the most efficient or effective way to create users in identity directory? Using IPS or direct connection from our own SCIM enabled solutions, IDM, IAM solution, whatever. And that's really not so easy to answer, because users you can create users in any kind of ways. You can manually create them, you can import a CSV. Of course, you can make use of the SCIM API, so integrate with your IDM. A lot of possible ways. Often it's really used. The IPS is used, and then you can connect the IPS to given source systems, and then just synchronize, for example, your Active Directory or your Azure Active Directory user base based on filters and that stuff, and groups and so on, to your identity directory. I will talk about this in a while and how it looks like. Yeah, and that's mainly let's say the most important questions. And also, as I said before, there are some federation modes that you can enable. So whenever you have already configured a corporate IDP in your IAS, you have seen these three options in the identity federation settings. So we always recommend really to persist users and to enable all three of those options. However, you can just switch on the use identity authentication user store. Then we are here at step 2. That means if IIS user is available, you can use user attributes sourced from the IIS user record. If not, you have to use your corporate identity provider assertion. If it's purely, you don't need really to use it, you can also switch it off, but then there you have no flexibility. You cannot influence the SAML name ID and so on for your application. So you have almost no way, and it brings no benefit if you have not enabled just this one. And finally, IIS as a proxy with federation. That means you can allow identity federation or identity authentication users only and apply configurations. That means that all users must have users profiles in the IIS, and only with this option enabled, you can, in addition to the authentication you may do on the corporate side, you can enforce risk-based authentication. That can be done based on, you can filter for specific groups. So not everyone who's authenticated should be able to access all applications in your IIS. Yeah, so you need to come up with a proper groups concept, and this also involves the risk-based authentication settings. Maybe also you have externals that you don't want to manage in your Azure AD or so you want to manage them in the IIS and enforce different kind of authentication for your external consultants and partners that connect to your cloud applications to support you, while your business users, your employees, they should have seamless single sign-on. That's really important to really get into that and understand why these federation settings are so powerful and what you can do with that. Okay, and that's, let's say, the last scenario where we really integrate the identity authentication in the same way. It's still a proxy. So the idea is that you have a corporate IDP. I will always use Azure AD as an example because it's often used. I would say 90% of all implementations are using Azure or ADFS, which is then migrated towards Azure AD in the next few years. So it is a standard. And you still have your accounts there. You have your conditional access policies, your Intune policies, your MFA scenarios, and all that stuff. But now, in addition, you now have also the identity authentication service that has its identity directory. And this identity directory you will fill with users, like using the IPS to provide user information to this directory. So now you have two IDPs, and you have also user information in the IIS. And the idea is that you have the profiles there. They have no credentials. They don't need credentials. As I said before, it's still authentication still happens here. But the user information synchronized from Azure, maybe, they are enriched with further attributes. For example, now those users will have a login name, they will have maybe employee ID, manager information, they will have maybe also these global user identifiers and some potentially required custom attributes that are often required for many SAP software as a service application use cases. And in addition to that, you can have a flexible configuration of your SAML name ID and maybe the claims, the group claims or additional assertion attributes that you want to send to the application, being completely independent from the corporate IDP. So don't have to manage about all these trusts and all these settings and create an enterprise application for each single SAP software application. And that's no longer recommended. That's the idea, to have, let's say, the identity authentication in the proxy mode with a full, let's say, with a full feature set. Yeah. So flow is exactly as it was before. User tries to access the SAP application, will be delegated to the primary IDP, and then based on conditional authentication rules, on settings that you can define for each application, you will be forwarded. You will authenticate as known in the corporate IDP side, and then the first SAML token will send to the identity authentication service. And now the magic begins. So now the SAML token contains a name identifier, and this name identifier is used to determine the identity, to propagate the identity to the identity directory service. Now IIS is in charge and can, let's say, mint a SAML token, an OpenID token containing the required attributes that are needed for the different applications in the cloud. Now that's, I would say, that's really the main benefit of having the IIS in between. But however, as I said before, it often leads to many discussions. So why do we have to persist our users? And well, we have synchronized users, and what's about passwords and so on. So there's really a lot of discussions about this. Yeah. So I really recommend always to set up this scenario, then you are really future-proof. But we can discuss this. All right, so I think we talked a lot about authentication and IIS now. So let's take a look. That's not all. Yeah, it's not all to consider. So take a look about the IPS and also some, let's say, I call it often used identity lifecycle scenarios. So I will first of all stick with that picture. So mainly it's about to get rid of manual created users. So whenever you have a lot of applications, it's really a time-consuming task to create your users in a manual way. So you think about automation very soon, as larger as your landscape will grow. So with the IPS, you can establish very simple approaches where no workflows, no IDM systems are involved at all. And of course, on top, there is a premium version, as always, where you integrate your IDM solution. We will also have a short look at the big picture later on. So SAP recommends designing an IAM landscape based on their reference architectures, and therefore the approach that we and scenarios that we present here are really rooted in these recommendations. And it's also not only recommendations from SAP, it's best practices and some experiences that we have made with projects with our customers. So let's take a closer look what we see here. So normally you have kind of a hiring process. There's a process that starts by creating a personal master data record in an HCM system, for example, if it is available. And based on that, normally user accounts and employee-related information are created in such connected systems. Like, for example, AD users created technical username, email address, often is written back to the HCM system and so on. Maybe it's also synchronized with the Azure. And that's often a starting point for the provisioning service. So it's a source system. You can consider Active Directory or Azure AD, both is possible, as a starting point. In this scenario, IPS is responsible for bringing the relevant user identities from the source system, like we see here, Azure or SuccessFactors, into the identity directory in the first step. And this can be done based on certain conditions. So rules, filters, a concept maybe for security groups should be established. Often it's based on user types, on application type, maybe on location, depending on how your organization is structured. And it allows you to, for example, to filter and only import Azure users based on their assigned group membership, and also to reflect those groups inside the identity directory. And then later on, these group assignments can also be used in transformations and to ensure, let's say, user provisioning, including assignment of the correct roles, because it's always, or it's mostly a group to role mapping when it comes to IPS, because in the identity directory we have just groups, and they often are mapped to, depending on the application, groups or even SAP role collections, for example, in the BTP. So this way, application managers finally can onboard new users by just ordering the assignment of the user to a group, via an existing process. Often it's used Microsoft Identity Management, like MIM or something like that, or maybe custom solutions that just add user to groups based on approvals workflows. And with the next job run, the creation of a new employee in Azure AD, or changes to user information like group assignments, attributes, or even the deactivation of an account, those events, they are captured via IPS, read from the source, and then forwarded, written into the target system. The first one, it's the identity directory. That's steps 1 to 3. But then also they are transported to the connected cloud applications, and that's steps 4 to 6 based on a job schedule. So now the new master is the identity directory because it consolidates all your user identities. It already contains, the best case, all your required attributes that you need. So you don't need to attach multiple sources anymore to connect to your many SAP SaaS applications and also BTP sub-accounts. That's the idea. So the same flow I can show you in a little bit different way. Here we can also add to this picture, let's say, the authentication. But first of all, let's see what we can see here. So we have the identity services here with the IPS and with the identity directory, and we have the on-premise world, let's say, where we still have a central user administration or exciting central workflows or any other solution that may support your on-premise systems and provision users using known standards and protocols. On the other side, we have the IPS that really is connected, for example, with the Azure AD or your on-premises AD using the Cloud Connector, and then your users will be provided in the identity directory. And based on that, also then later on connected applications. Now, if we add the authentication, we can have a big picture about, let's say, not only provisioning, but also the authentication part. I think it's obvious you have now your IAS. IAS is connected to your corporate IDP and all your, let's say, cloud applications, and maybe your on-premise applications are federated with the IAS. So if a user accesses the application, it will be forwarded to IAS and ultimately forwarded to the corporate IDP. That's mainly, let's say, a typical integration scenario when it comes to authentication and identity lifecycle management best practice. So it must not be just Active Directory as a source, as we can see here on the picture, but can be any other system. However, it's as more sources you have, as more complex will be the setup. So it's not so easy to consolidate data from many sources into the identity directory, because things are getting overridden with the next resyncs and so on. So you have to really take care about what you do. Yeah. That's one scenario without IDM. And the simplified approach that we see before is just one of many options, as I said. And if you have, for example, an SAP IDM or an IDM solution from another vendor, similar solution can be implemented. So many SAP customers have an SAP IDM that's often connected to the HCM, maybe of the GRC, the integration with the GRC system as well. And yeah, now you can provision and provide users to your on-premises systems using connectors, and also to the non-SAP third-party systems. That still was the case all the years before. So it's still point-to-point connections, and often custom connectors that you have to develop when it comes to any kind of third-party applications. So now, if the central identity management system must still directly control all these provisioning flows, it is recommended to replicate also the users from the identity management solution to the SAP Cloud Identity Services Identity Directory. This is the first step. So as identity provisioning is used as a proxy between your IDM and the cloud applications on the other side, that means there is no need to develop, to create custom connectors anymore. So for example, the SAP Identity Management 8 uses the SCIM 2.0 connector. So any SAP solution that is supported via an IPS connector can be operated as a IPS SCIM proxy system, meaning that even if your remote SAP systems, some SaaS systems, may not yet have a SCIM API, the IPS normalizes everything to the SCIM standard. So the identity management system can just talk about the proxy with a proxy system. So it reads user data from the cloud system based on a defined mapping and data formats that you can define in the IPS, and it sends it to the identity management. So if changes like create, update, delete are made in the IDM, a new job is automatically triggered. It applies changes in the external backend so that both systems become up to date and synchronized. Yeah? So the complete user provisioning process is done, for example, stick with SAP IDM here, with SAP IDM, and the identity management database is really considered as a single point of truth. So that means that all changes related to user address, data, attributes, permissions that are stored is all in one place, and the data can be queried anytime for audit purposes. But of course, the IDM solution stays in charge of the correctness and consistency of user data. That makes it easier to consolidate many systems and then just have one integration to your identity directory. And even you can also write back attributes like the SAP global user ID that is created only here. You can write back this information to your IDM as well. It's just also not only this, but also in the best case, this is based on business role assignments in your IDM. It supports approval workflow. So you have a completely different, let's say, setup now compared with the pure IPS jobs that are used. That's really high level here. And if you want to dive deeper, I can just recommend you looking at the recommendations from SAP. I will show you in the conclusion and in the takeaway part some sources of information, how you can find more information about that. But generally, other third-party IDM solutions like a SailPoint, like an Omada, like an One Identity, or you name it, can be integrated in a similar way. So it's always that you really take care about having your connections that you still have to your maybe on-premise systems, to your supported cloud applications directly from your IDM, and then integrate with the identity directory. And if possible, your IDM can still connect directly to SaaS applications as well. If it supports SCIM, it's fine. However, if not, you can make use of the IPS as a proxy system and then just support almost all applications that are supported out of the box by the IPS. Let's add here authentication as well to have the big picture complete. Same process as I mentioned before. That's a integration with a central identity management solution like an SAP IDM or a third-party one. All right, that was a lot of information, I guess. So let me quickly talk about some sources of further information and conclude what we've just heard and see. First of all, here's listed some benefits of the cloud identity services. You don't need to read it now. You can read anytime later on. Also some best practices, it's more or less our best practices when it comes to authentication, when it comes to identity lifecycle, because we often made the experiences in the customer projects when it comes to IAS, IPS. There's not only one tenant available. There's really a confusing amount of tenants available, and applications are connected to different tenants, and you have no overview. And the idea is really to first centralize it, to have some central tenants set up to manage the trust correctly, and then to get started with your identity lifecycle setup, with your attributes that we require, connecting all your systems and that stuff. That's really some best practices outlined here that we really recommend. Also, the system integration guide provides a lot of scenario recommendations when it comes to integrate with success factors, with third-party HCM solutions, with multiple source systems, with single source systems. Also, you should really take a look here at these guides, and also it's a must-read, the CIO guide for the identity lifecycle in hybrid landscapes. Also, the SAP reference architecture blocks for single sign-on and identity lifecycle. It's not, some of them are quite old, but it's still, I would say, it's still quite current, the information that you can obtain from there. In addition, I've prepared you with a collection of the latest exciting SAP Cloud Security blogs. You can have a quick overview here and get some more details if you want. Also, we have our new service, which is called the SAP Exciting Quick Start implementation for the SAP Cloud Identity Services. It really helps you to set the foundation for ID lifecycle and authentication, meaning we really help you to connect in a small pilot environment two applications and set up authentication in the ID lifecycle for them. So get more information embedded here, information to the flyer and so on. And lastly, I like to point out there is a webinar. So it's obviously a German webinar. So maybe we have one in English as well, about the hybrid IDM landscape. So it's really, my colleagues will show you this on 21st of April. Really this scenario to connect your sub IDM with the identity provisioning service and to really provision users to cloud applications like Azure, like SAP Analytics Cloud and that stuff. And they really show also some live demonstrations, which I have not done today. Sorry for that. All right. So I would say that was enough information. I like to really say thank you for attending the session. And I hope it was informative and provided a really, let's say, good understanding of the cloud identity services. And as Katja already has said, we will respond to your questions that we may have received via the chat. We make the answers available together with a presentation to all participants. Yeah, I would like to say thank you, take care, and see you next time. Bye-bye.